Hello, this is NewFilmmakers LA in partnership with Movie Maker magazine. And my name is Talis Correa. I'm here at South Park Center, and we're gonna talk about an incredible film called Impossible Town. Let's take a look.
I call this Death Valley Highway. Merle died of cancer there. Bill Hazlett here, he died of cancer. He died of cancer, brain tumor, blood disorder, throat cancer. How can you tell me there's not a problem?
Last year, the Department of Natural Resources found transformers leaking oil full of PCBs.
PCBs is incredibly toxic. We banned them in this country because they are so toxic.
An experimental effort to remove the PCBs from the soil on site failed.
Through both Republican and Democrat administrations, no one has cared enough to say, hey, what is going on?
And we're here with the filmmaker, Scott Faris. Thank you so much for being here with us, Scott. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. You know, it's a Saturday. Weather's beautiful.
Right.
It's a little on the cooler side. I think fall has arrived in Los Angeles.
Exactly. We just watched a clip from your latest film, Impossible Town. Tell us a little bit about the synopsis and what the film is about.
Yeah, Impossible Town is the story of a Southern West Virginia physician, Dr. Ayn Amjad, whose father passes away very unexpectedly and leaves her with this legacy of unfinished activism work. So in order to bring closure to both his work and his memory, she concocts this wildly ambitious plan to relocate the town of Minden, West Virginia, from its current location, which is a little valley sort of inundated with chemicals left over from the mining industry, to a 97-acre tract of land that she buys. And so that's where the film begins, with this wild dream to relocate an entire town. And we follow her over the course of 4.5 years, and you get to see whether or not she's successful, but more importantly, how she changes along the way.
Yeah. Now, your film is beautiful. It's very interesting how through a story of a situation happening on a specific town, and it happens to be West Virginia, a very iconic, important historically for this country, right? And you shot in over 4 years, right? There's like a span of that time in the story following the subjects. And it was very interesting how your film touches, it's not just personal, but also it becomes like a grand speech on the momentum of political time that we're living in. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I think first and foremost, we are playing in a genre of documentary, which is the environmental justice genre, where there are lots of examples of stories that are, I would say, issue-driven. So they are focused on an issue or a place, and they cover a span of time. And the lens that the filmmakers take is really on whether or not the issue is resolved and how it's resolved. And I think there are some really good examples of storytelling in that space. Harlan County, USA, I think, was always a reference that we went back to. Barbara Koppel's work, and that was amazing. But we wanted to take a slightly different tack in the sense that we feel that character-driven storytelling, particularly in documentary, feels satisfying to us just as viewers, as lovers of film. We love when you can watch a story that is really rooted in a character's perspective. And so from the very beginning, our goal was to tell the story of Minden through the eyes of Dr. Amjad, and really, in that sense, to cover her grief process. What does it look like, not just to try to move a town, but really how is that an extension of the grief she's feeling at the loss of her father? And so in that way, it's really the story of like our relationship with our parents and our own mortality. So yes, there are political elements here. And yes, it does speak to the culture of sort of the urban-rural divide, the sort of coastal, middle of America divide. But I think what hopefully feels universal and relatable about it is that you've got this group of characters who are all dealing with a situation that they feel is life and death. They're worried about their children. They're concerned about their parents and their relatives. They have strong feelings about places that they associate with as home, which I think is something we can all relate to. And at the end of the day, it's about their experiences as people and not some broad issue that we're asking you to care about, or we're like, reprimanding our audience for not knowing enough about. It's about the people at the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah. Now it's beautiful to see that how in face of a common issue in the town, like how people get together, right? Like how different kinds of people come together to resolve, and so it was really interesting how you were able to portray that.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually kind of a striking racial diversity in the folks that are represented in the film. And often people will watch it and then ask us, well, why did you omit the commentary about race? You know, you must have cut out the parts where people are talking about racial segregation or the fact that people are coming together across lines of racial difference. And the honest truth is we did not omit any of that. People did not talk about it.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, but I think that there is a tendency, especially if you live on the coasts, the East Coast or the West Coast, to look at places like West Virginia through a predominantly racial lens and to notice first and foremost, like, oh, it's predominantly white, and oh, the folks that are people of color must feel constantly like oppressed by that. And that's not to say that there aren't complicated racial dynamics at play, but I would push back a little bit and say that I don't think that that's top of mind for the folks that actually live in these places as much as it is for the people looking in from the outside.
Yeah.
And so that was interesting. That's always fun to talk about that.
Yeah,
folks.
no, and that's why I think films like yours is really important, because then you're like inside those people's lives, and you know when we watch your film, we see how personal it is, and then how much you're touching on the humanity of each character and the journey of the main subject, and you see, like, we never know, but that, like, there's rarely a bias on it. Like, we don't see that there's a bias. Like, it's hard nowadays. Everybody thinks like we're leaning somewhere, right? Like, the mainstream media is doing this, or this filmmaker wants to do this. But when you're doing a documentary, there is a character I think, like, the main character of a filmmaker, let me know if I'm not tripping here, the main worry of a filmmaker when they're doing a documentary, or even a piece of story, but especially a documentary, is to make sure, like what you said in the beginning, that there's a cohesive arc, a beginning, middle, and end. That there's and then if you are set yourself to tell the story about a town or about someone, I think that, like, and you're not gonna want to manipulate their opinions, because, like, whatever they bring you is gold, right? And then you're more worried about the arc of does that ring true, or do you think?
That rings true. I think it's actually a complicated dance between three different factors. Number one, you're thinking about your audience.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the stuff that you're saying about story structure, beginning, middle, and end, and just how, you know, the pace of it, that's where that sort of thing comes into play. You're constantly aware that you don't want people to be bored when they're sitting in a darkened room watching your film. The second element you're thinking about is your participants, right? The subjects in your film, because, as you said, you don't want to misrepresent them. You want to make sure that they feel, at the very least, even if they don't like the film that you made, that they feel that they were represented honestly and truthfully, that they were not manipulated to achieve some nefarious goal. And then the third thing you're thinking about is yourself. And I think this is where documentary is maybe slightly different than journalism. Meg is my co-director. We do not view ourselves necessarily as journalists. We are documentary filmmakers. And I think the difference that we draw is that we do care about a subjective sensibility that we bring to the stories that we're telling. We are interested in specific elements of our characters' lives and of the arcs that we're capturing. And we want to emphasize those things. We want to make something that we, as hypothetical audience members, would be interested in watching. And I think that's okay. But I do think you have to balance those sort of three elements: audience, participants, and then yourself and the things that you prefer.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And picking up from there, like, tell us a little bit, like, backtrack a little bit our journey. Tell us, how did you get into filmmaking and up into doing this film?
Yeah.
Right here.
It's probably the oldest story in the book, but I always loved movies as a kid, right? You hear that a million times.
You're like that Star Wars kid. Oh, my dad.
I was literally that Star Wars kid. I just last week was having dinner with my aunt, and she was telling stories.
I think you're one of the last Star Wars filmmakers.
I might be one of the last Star Wars kids. I cannot imagine young children today being as inspired by the Star Wars that we have as I was by the original Star Wars, but let's not go there. I think my journey as a filmmaker, though, started in earnest, not when I went to films. I was fortunate to go to film school, which feels now like a luxury.
Yeah.
But it was actually my first job after I graduated, which had nothing to do with film. I was a 5th grade teacher in South Dakota through a program called Teach for America.
Wow, South Dakota.
In South Dakota, on the Rosebud Reservation.
Okay.
Very, very rural part of the country. I lived in a town of about 400 people.
This was before your film
This is before
film school.
This is after film school, actually.
Where did you go for film school?
So I went to film school at NYU, and I graduated in 2008.
NYU filmmaker
film
right
school.
here, guys. Come on.
But it's funny because when I was at NYU, which is a wonderful program, I don't want to speak poorly of the education that I received, but the implicit messages that we were receiving from our professors at the time was sort of like, your goal is to be the next Martin Scorsese.
Okay.
Your goal is to be the next Spike Lee. And if you fall short of that, sorry, you don't have what it takes, kid.
Oh, so there's a lot of pressure.
So there's a lot of pressure and a lot of competition. And it was like an all or nothing mentality. Like you will be an auteur director or you will be a dentist, probably, right?
Wow.
And what I discovered as a 5th grade teacher was, number one, an issue in the world that I actually had really strong feelings about, which is the quality and availability of the education that young people in this country are receiving. And that got me really fired up in a way that filmmaking couldn't, because it felt urgent and it felt immediate and it felt like there was a role to play for someone like me. And so after I left the classroom, I was only a 5th grade teacher for 2 years, I started to think in terms of how can I combine that education that I received as a storyteller with this newfound passion for education and social impact broadly. And specifically, I started to think, how can I tell stories that will positively impact my students and their families, or students and families like them? And that sent me down a path that, had I not had that experience in the classroom, I never would have walked. And so what I always tell people when they ask, like, oh, how did your career as a filmmaker start? It's like, yeah, I loved movies and I went to film school and I did all that, but it wasn't until I realized that you actually need to care about something beyond simply the craft of filmmaking in order to have a successful career, that I felt like my career actually began. You know, I think of filmmaking as a vehicle for storytelling, but what goes in the vehicle? Who's driving? What's in the car that you're, piloting?
And it's interesting what you said, because you started at NYU and then you step back a little bit to find something that you were urgent. And I feel a lot of filmmakers have that anxiety to be, I don't think it's just like an NYU privilege pressure. I feel even if you haven't been to film school, there is just by looking at the festivals and circuit and the community, there is that pressure of my debut film gotta launch me or I cannot fail on this or I gotta keep going. I gotta be that pressure of constantly putting excellence for out of the bat, right? Without even having time for us to experiment and try or even live, like you said. So I think is important for us to you study film, you did a little bit, and then it's okay to be wait, hold on. There's this part of my life that I want to experience, observe, and then you get back to it. It doesn't mean that you're giving up filmmaking because you came back to the grind, to the trenches.
I came back to the trenches through a really circuitous route, where I was a teacher. Then I worked in nonprofits for a couple of years. And then finally, in my late 20s, I got a job making video stories for the nonprofit that I was working with. And that's where I met my co-director, Meg.
Nice.
And then in 2017, we started our company, Universe Creative. And we're very fortunate to be able to make short docs full-time for nonprofits and foundations in the social impact space.
Wow.
So the encouragement I would give to aspiring filmmakers or even established filmmakers is continue to push for the intersection of storytelling and the other things in your life that you love. Because I think that's where the magic happens, when you're able to find the Venn diagram overlap between all those different things.
Yeah. No, that's important for sure. I think a lot of people, me included, I'll be honest, in my young ages, doing films, because filmmaking is a passion of a lot of people, right? Films are a passion. And then sometimes when I go out, I'll be what do you like to do? It's film, but at the same time you do film as a career, but then it's your hobby. But I think it's important for us to step out of that box a little bit. I'm not saying abandon, but like step out of the box and say like, what else in life there is that I could.
Yeah, and that's not to criticize, self-proclaimed film heads, film lovers. I love movies. I probably consume far too many than is healthy, but it's also just important not to forget to be a well-rounded person. I always tell people the only human being that I'm aware of for whom it is enough just to love film and film alone is Quentin Tarantino. He's like the only person who's been able to build a career just on like I love
loving
movies,
films
and I'm just going to emulate the things that I love.
And a lot of people,
good for him. That's great.
A lot of people put a Tarantino bar, right?
Yes.
Like Tarantino, like I gotta watch 200,000 films a day, and know how to put everything.
But I think if you think critically about it, you realize quickly like we don't want to live in a world where every filmmaker is like a Quentin Tarantino. Like one Quentin Tarantino is enough. Maybe two. If there's his protege or something, sure. But I think we need people who are approaching it.
I love him, by the way. Love him, by the way.
He's great.
Love him.
I am not saying anything negative.
Yeah, no, I love
awesome.
him for what he is, and thank you for being that.
Yes.
I'm not like you, unfortunately. I will be lucky. I'm not going to try to force myself to be like you. I've been to his new Beverly Film Theater here in Los Angeles.
It's incredible.
It's incredible.
And now the Vista in Los Feliz.
He opened another one.
Yeah.
And I also listened to his podcast for those ones. I think it's called Video Archive. He's funny. He's a cool dude.
He's a cool dude. He's a singular talent. And I think the point is like we shouldn't necessarily try to imitate that.
Exactly.
Instead, like be the best version of you as a filmmaker, bringing into play all the things that you love and are passionate about.
100% agree. Now for something a little bit more, how can I say, challenging question.
Hit me.
Why do you choose doing documentaries versus narrative? Like what is your lean towards that as opposed to the other?
I choose documentary over narrative for a bunch of really pragmatic reasons.
Okay.
I think the barrier to entry is much lower. I've always been a fan of grabbing a camera and running out and just starting to film, as opposed to raising $10 million and assembling like an all-star cast and crew.
Yeah, $10 million, where is that nowadays?
Right, where is that? I've never had an answer to that question. So the barrier to entry is lower. I think that there are much more sustainable careers to be had in the nonfiction filmmaking side of the equation. When we started our company, Universe Creative, in 2017, it was really with a giant question mark. We knew that we were interested in doc storytelling in the social impact space, but we didn't know if there would be enough business to stay in business. And so we came up with like a 1-year game plan. And we were like, if at the end of this year, we have not found enough paying clients, we'll fold and we'll just go do something else, and that's fine. And I think you almost have to have that mentality when you're going into it, which is like, give yourself a runway. This is my 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, whatever it is for you, depending on your financial resources, and have a game plan and have benchmarks for success. And if you don't meet the benchmarks, it's probably reasonable to have like a real honest conversation with yourself, which is like, okay, I wasn't able to meet my benchmarks. Why? And what should I do now? So that's what we did. And what we found is that there are just many more people who live in the world who are willing to pay for really great short nonfiction work than there are people who are clamoring to fund short scripted pieces. And my passion, as I said, was always storytelling. I thought I would be working in narrative, but it wasn't a deal breaker for me. And that was something that I discovered along the way. And so there might be some who hear that and think like, oh, that's a compromise. You compromised on your dream. I will tell you, it doesn't feel that way to me. I love what I do. And I feel really lucky.
Finding a knowledge, like finding information that you didn't have and change your perspective. Why not?
Exactly. And I also lastly, I'll just say that I think there are so many interesting things happening in the world around us that it just feels sometimes like shooting fish in a barrel. And so there are people who are wonderfully gifted writers. And when I see a great narrative film, I'm always in awe of the talent involved in bringing that to life. But for me, it just feels like the most obvious route to telling really interesting stories is just to turn the lens onto the things that we're seeing in the world around us.
Yeah.
And so it feels right in that sense. Maybe it's just an instinct. That's
no,
why
and I think you got a right instinct, because if you think about it, like nowadays, like Netflix, right? It really brought a light to documentaries in a mass, in a mass audience. Like people were like I never seen people saying like I love documentaries, like but non-filmmaker people saying that, like people who are not in the industry, like friends that say like, oh, I love watching documentaries. That's a phrase that like Tarantino probably didn't hear when he was starting like in the 90s or back in the days. That's a new thing. It's great, right?
Yeah, and I think the divisions between doc and narrative are becoming really hazy.
Yeah.
I mean, you see narrative filmmakers like Chloe Zhao and Sean Baker,
Sure.
whose narrative work increasingly feels
like
unscripted. And then on the other side, you see doc filmmakers like Elaine McMillan Sheldon, who did King Cole most recently.
Yeah.
Whose doc work starts to feel a little more narrative in nature. And there are lots of other doc filmmakers like that. And so I think that probably the coolest, most impactful stories that we'll see over the next 10 to 20 years are going to exist somewhere in between what we classically think of as like narrative scripted work and total verite doc work.
Yeah. No, last night we showed the film called The Walk.
Yes.
Right with you.
We missed it sadly because our flight was delayed.
Yeah.
But I was so excited reading about it because it sounds like that is
it's
one of
exactly
those
what you just
in-between
described.
films.
It's like is a very different type of documentary. There's like some sort of a neorealism to it. Is very interesting. Like it's blending that genre that you described. Scott, what is next for you? What's in the works? What are you going to release next? Tell us.
Yeah. We always have somewhere in the realm of like 6 or so short docs that are in various stages of pre-production, production, post-production. We've been shooting a ton in the fall, so we're actually traveling to Texas on Monday morning to continue work on our next sort of self-driven short doc, which we're tentatively calling Life of the Party. And it tracks 3 Republican women in the state of Texas who are all at various stages of their career and various places on the ideological spectrum. Some are quite moderate in their views, some are quite far right. And we're exploring the questions of how has the Republican Party evolved, both in the state of Texas and then nationally over the past 25 years, and what does the future of that party look like, especially for the women who are often identified as the backbone of that party. Is there actually room for their full participation, and how will they influence party politics moving forward? So that's something that we should wrap before the end of the calendar year, and then hopefully have some sort of final cut like in the spring of next year.
Nice. And how can we follow your work? Is there any website or social media you want to share?
There's a website, universecreative.org, but probably the best way is just to follow us on Instagram. Our account is @storiesforgood, all spelled out.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here with us and having this conversation. It was
This
awesome.
was such a pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure. And this was Scott, and thank you so much. We will see you next time.